And civil society group Yiaga Africa says there were inconsistencies in collated results in the election, suggesting that some figures were altered. In its post-election statement, the organization noted that, and I quote, while INEC consistently applied its guidelines in managing the accreditation and voting process in several polling units, there were incidents that created doubts on the integrity of the process, end quote. Now, it condemned acts of violence and disruption of voting and results collation by political thugs and hoodlums, particularly violence directed at voters and election officials. Well, it said these unwholesome acts undermine the integrity of the elections. Yiaga Africa says its reports sampled from 287 of 300 polling units indicate statistical inconsistencies with the official results released by INEC. Right, join me now is the Executive Director of Yiaga Africa, Samson Itodo. Good to have you on Newsnight tonight.
Good evening.
I'm sure you've responded to several questions as to the conduct of this election, but let's go straight to the point that you've made in this statement, post-election statement on the September 2024 Edo election. Inconsistencies in the officially announced results. Break it down for us in a way that will make sense.
Well, thank you very much, and good evening once again. In this election, Yiaga Africa deployed its process and results verification for transparency methodology, the PRVT. And what the methodology does is we look at a random sample of polling units, deploy stationary observers who stay at the polling units, from the commencement to the end of the process. And because we deploy to a statistically representative sample of polling units, we are able to release what we call estimates, the watching the votes estimates for the vote share that each candidate is supposed to get. This election is the 17th governorship election that we've deployed this methodology. Right. And we've also deployed it for 2 presidential elections in 2019 and in 2023, and they were all deployed successfully. What happened in the Edo election, for instance, we get results from the polling units, those sampled polling units. And because we apply statistical principles and technology, we are able to provide information that represents what happens in other polling units. For this election, the process of accreditation, voting, and recording of results at the polling unit complied substantially with the procedure. In other words, those processes were seamless and they were transparent. The challenge with this election was that when the results came to the collation center, in those 4 local governments that we highlighted, those results were manipulated, they were altered, and so some of the vote shares fell outside the margin. And this was actually across board. So the real issue with the election is the collation process. Right. And so results were altered. So a classic example, if you look at Oredo, for instance, there was a 10% increase in the results that was announced for the party that won Oredo. And those results, based on our analysis, clearly shows that they were deducted, from one of the parties and then added. So there were a lot of deductions and additions at the collation level. But at the polling unit level, the results and the votes that were recorded, they were recorded correctly. It was when it came to the polling unit. The second point was in places like Ikpoba-Awka, where the collation was disrupted. The guidelines is very clear that the stages of collation, from ward to local government and then to state. But what happened was that in Ikpoba-Awka, the collation was not done at the local government level, even though there was no provocation, because we had, in all the 18 local governments, we had local government collation observers who were there to observe this process. And you clearly see that there was a lack of transparency. And that is why those inconsistencies were spotted, because the beauty of the PRVT methodology is if in the course of the entire results management value chain, any results have been altered, the PVT is able to detect it because we rely on the granular results that comes from the polling unit.
Before this election, there was always the concern that the collation center was the weakest link, if you like, in the electoral process. So apparently that's what you're finding out this time.
Yes.
What needs to happen going forward?
I think
we have Ondo, you know, in November.
Well, in terms of long-term action that needs to be taken, this election has reinforced the fact that we need electronic transmission of results, because the results that were on INEC IREV portal, and you had to commend INEC, because those results, as at 6 p.m., you know, on election day, about 90% of results were already on the portal, right? But the legality of those results on the portal, you know, is not guaranteed because of the decision of the Supreme Court that the IREV is not part of the collation system.
So is this where the Electoral Act needs to come in?
Even if you have mutilations, yes, even if you have mutilations, those results on the portal, you know, don't have any legal effect based on the interpretation and the decision of the Supreme Court.
They're not actionable at all.
At all. This is why, because it's not part of the collation system. So what needs to be done is that the National Assembly, you know, needs to amend the law to integrate electronic transmission into our electoral process and make it compulsory. The second thing that needs to be done is that INEC needs to thoroughly investigate, and it owes it to Nigerians, what were the reasons for those inconsistencies in places like Ego, places like Oredo and Ikpobaoka. And I must say that it's not just the APC. The three major parties altered, you know, results, and they were all beneficiaries of all this mutilation. The good news, however, is that when you look at the turnout, they didn't alter the turnout, because there are ways you can rig elections. You can increase the turnout, and then
but there were instances of overvoting.
No, overvoting is different from turnout. Right? You can inflate turnout figures, and then those figures that you inflate, you add it to a particular political party. You can also manipulate rejected ballots, and so you can convert rejected ballots into valid votes, and you add them to a particular. But those were not what happened in this particular election. What happened was simply that deductions were made in the course of collation, and they were added to the parties.
I mean, you point out that INEC, look, let me just read it out here. Yiaga Africa strongly condemns the actions of some biased INEC officials who altered figures during collation, including the actions of some security officials. So two culprits here, INEC officials and security operatives. Now, leaving out the political parties and what have you.
No, because who has a responsibility
who carries out this action at the collation
It's the ward,
level?
It's the ward collation, the ward collation officers, the local government collation officers, as well as who you have a state returning officer. The big question is, and anyone who is conscientious knows very well that there were manipulations in those local governments. It is clear, the evidence is there. But it was a collation officer, you know, that did that. So they need to investigate. As election observers, we're not interested in whoever benefits from this entire process. We're interested in the process. We've raised questions on the process. We've discharged our duties as observers. What we expect INEC to do is to investigate and look at those results. If you look at the polling unit's results, whether on IREV or based on our estimate, you can clearly see that there were inconsistencies and manipulations were done at the collation level.
Let me take you back to the point you made earlier, because as you were making that point, I was thinking, how is it that beneficiaries, those who benefited from a faulty process, let me just, you know, use that advisedly, do you think they would want to go ahead and amend the electoral law in a way that will, you know, give further, you know, strength, especially at the uploading, the IREV level?
I think that.
Do you think they'll be willing to do that?
Our political class need to understand that they're damaging they're damaging our institutions.
Right. And democracy itself.
And democracy itself. The lack of trust and confidence that citizens have on our democratic institutions is just sad. Look at Edo State, 22% 30% turnout,
Yeah.
lower than the 27 recorded in what? In 2020. A lot of Nigerians don't trust our democratic institutions. They don't trust our electoral process. And that is dangerous for our democracy.
So what do you think will
this is
happen
why
with this National Assembly? Do you think
I think this National Assembly needs to undertake reforms. Yes, they need to put the nation first. They need to put our democracy first than any other.
Is that likely to happen?
Well, we have to keep up.
How
That's
do we
why
ensure,
democracy
how
is
do we
about
ensure
engagement.
that they do that?
This is where citizens have a critical role to play. We need to keep asking those questions. Civil society has done its part. We have unraveled cases of manipulation. Those who are responsible for taking action need to take action. But I think the National Assembly, INEC, our political parties, our security agencies have a fundamental task of rebuilding trust and confidence on the part of people. Because this, disengagement from the electoral process that we see does not augur well for our democracy.
And there was vote buying,
vote buying went to a
things.
different height, and it's just really heartbreaking that we saw votes sold for as high as 10,000 naira per voter. And this is one of the darkest, and sore points of the election, that voters were trading, their votes. And the election, was really determined by the highest spender. And by the way, all the parties, especially the major parties, bought votes. The observers saw them. We saw them with our own eyes. They are agents who were buying votes. And so let no political party, come and pontificate as though they didn't buy votes. But they all, what happened in this election? All the major political parties were culprits. It was just a game of who outsmarted the other. But then we were relying on a system, and a protection agency like INEC, to limit the excesses of those political actors. But in this particular case, those biased INEC officials who managed the collation process, really failed. This failed the people.
Well, I hope they don't get away with it,
process.
And all of those people
that's our prayer and expectation.
I have to say thank you very much, Samson Itodo, Executive Director, Yiaga Africa.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us.